If you walked into a medieval town square wearing the wrong fur, no one needed to ask who you were. They already knew, or at least they believed they did. And that belief was the architecture of power. Because in pre-modern Europe, power didn't just rule through armies or taxation. It ruled through recognition, and fur was one of its sharpest tools. This wasn't about winter. Peasants were cold all the time. No emergency legislation was passed for that. This was about visibility. Hierarchy only works if it can be read instantly. If a noble and a merchant look indistinguishable from across the street, hierarchy collapses into doubt. And doubt is expensive. So the solution was simple: make status permanent. Attach it to the body. Across places like England and France, sumptuary laws dictated what each rank could wear. Not vague moral guidance. Specific classifications. What servants could wear. What merchants could wear. What knights could wear. The state wasn't regulating fabric. It was regulating resemblance. Because resemblance destabilizes hierarchy. If a merchant could dress like a lord, the visual boundary dissolved. And once the boundary dissolves, authority must defend itself with force. Clothing was cheaper than violence, so resemblance became illegal. Under Edward III, 14th century England issued detailed clothing restrictions. Certain furs were reserved for specific ranks. Ermine, sable, marten. These weren't just warm materials. They were controlled signals. Scarcity turned into legitimacy. To wear rare fur was to display access to trade routes, to land, to networks of extraction. It wasn't insulation. It was a certificate. But law alone cannot sustain hierarchy. For the system to stabilize, people had to see these distinctions as natural. Not imposed, natural. And this is how normalization works. First, restrict access. Then ritualize the restriction. Judges wore fur in court. Kings lined coronation robes with it. Portraits repeated the image. Authority became textured. Generation after generation associated fur with legitimacy. Association turned into expectation. Expectation turned into common sense. Common sense turned into morality. Now the peasant wearing restricted fur wasn't just unlawful. He was improper, out of place. The population began enforcing the boundary themselves. That is the shift power waits for. When control migrates from law to instinct. Even women's clothing was folded into the system. In parts of Europe, the amount of fur a woman could wear depended on her husband's rank. Her appearance broadcasted his legitimacy. Hierarchy didn't just sit in castles. It circulated through households, through aesthetics, through daily life. Over time, enforcement weakened. Economic reality strained visual control. But by then, the deeper transformation had already occurred. The code no longer needed constant policing. It had been internalized. Fur still felt aristocratic, even when punishment faded. That is when a symbol outlives the law. And that is when hierarchy becomes durable. We think we have moved beyond that world. But the issue was never fur. The issue was who is allowed to look like whom. In the Middle Ages, the law prohibited resemblance. Today, the law doesn't need to. The boundaries are so thoroughly absorbed that we guard them ourselves. And that is when power reaches its most stable form. When it no longer needs to announce itself. When it no longer needs to justify itself. When it simply feels natural.